Hi, I'm Pim from Metal TV, and you're listening to the Tomorrow with Rovio podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Tomorrow with Rovio podcast. I'm your host, Ben Mattis, and today I'm recording this intro sequence from the brand new work in progress Rovio Montreal offices. So for the first time in, frankly, a couple of years, I'm out from my home office into the real world, interacting and working with real people again, and it feels fantastic. So in the coming months, you'll probably be seeing me doing some additional recordings from this space, and maybe one day interviewing some of the people from this space. But for now, I want to talk about our guest today and what our subject of conversation is. And I thought I wanted to open with a confession in case it wasn't entirely clear to all of you. I am a lifelong gaming nerd. I always have been, and I'm proud of it. I've been playing games since I was a kid, spent probably thousands and thousands and thousands of hours in various online, persistent world multiplayer games, whether they be competitive shooters or brawlers or MMOs. And many of my favorite memories from time spent with friends took place inside these digital worlds. Now, when I had those memories with other people, then we had a conversation point that we could share out of game. We could go for a drink, or we could meet on the schoolyard and we could talk about, hey, remember that really awesome thing that happened? That was so cool. But sometimes I'm playing with people I don't know, or I'm playing alone. And when cool things happen there, I want to share those experiences with people, but they're not shared memories, right? They weren't there. They didn't live it. So I need to find a way to sort of help them picture what happened and why it was so cool and why it was so meaningful to me. And pandemic has clearly put more and more people into this position where there's growing number of people who spend growing amount of time online and in these virtual worlds. And as our guest today says so eloquently, their camera roll because of their real life is probably getting smaller and smaller. And they're looking for ways to sort of capture these memories of these online experiences, and the need to sort of capture and share these memories of these online experiences getting larger and larger. Pim de Witte, the CEO of Metal, is my guest today. And Metal is a tool that seeks to solve exactly that problem. How can you very quickly capture and share memories, events, things that took place inside these gaming experiences that are becoming increasingly important in the lives of a larger number of people, and share them with friends who may or may not have been there, and sort of archive those in the same way that we archive real life memories in our camera roll, when we take a photo or we film an event. And when I started paying attention to Metal a year or so ago, I started to see more and more instances of these clips being shared inside the social networks and the feeds that matter to me, Twitter and LinkedIn, etc. I saw more and more sort of mentions of Metal and these clips being shared. And so it caught my attention as someone that I thought would be interesting to speak to and sort of understand what Pim's thought process are, what his team's thoughts are about how the act of clipping and sharing is going to increasingly become a kind of critical component in our digital selves as we increasingly spend time in digital worlds, whether they be gaming or other, today and in the future. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Pim de Witte, CEO of Metal. And as always, thanks for listening. Pim, nice to talk to you again. Thanks for agreeing to do this. It's been fun chatting with you online. We had a quick chat a couple of weeks ago to sort of prepare for this. I usually open this the same way with everyone. So it's an opportunity just for you to sort of introduce yourself, talk a little bit about maybe what you did before founding Metal and sort of how that led into Metal, which is probably what we'll spend most of the episode talking about.
Perfect. So my name is Pim de Witte. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Metal.tv. Before founding Metal, I got into coding by modding RuneScape when I was about 13 or 14 years old, and started somewhat accidentally the largest private server on the planet for RuneScape. By the time I was 18, yeah, it was a little bit of a hobby that got a bit out of control. By the time I was 18, my private server was doing roughly, I don't know, $1.5 million in annual revenue. We were employing a lot of people. Yeah, I did that until I was about 19. After running the private server for RuneScape, I decided that I wanted to take a little bit of a break from the games industry in general, and I decided that I wanted to focus primarily on like social impact work. So I actually spent 2.5 years roughly working for Doctors Without Borders.
That's a big shift. RuneScape to Doctors Without Borders. That's like full 180.
Yeah, the story there is I always really liked to go to hackathons, and I had went to hackathons before where Doctors Without Borders was there. And this was right around the time, like we knew we were going to have to shut our private server down. And this was right around the time of the Ebola outbreak. And the Ebola outbreak was getting quite bad at the time. This was, let's see, I think this was right before there was the first case in the US of Ebola. Where there was some understanding that outbreak was going to be pretty bad. So Doctors Without Borders actually called me. A friend named Ivan called me and said, "Hey, we have a few of these problems, and I know that you specialize in some of these areas." Part of that was like building like local network infrastructure because from private servers, all our stuff ran on local networks. So they called me and asked, "Hey, do you want to help?" And my first answer was, "Sure, I'll give it a shot." Ended up kind of loving it so much that I stayed there for 2.5 years, working on all sorts of things. So I started working on a project called Project Buendia, which is a locally deployed medical record system for Ebola specifically. It was, and then we worked with Google on that project. It was a tablet with what's called a polycarbonate casing, which you could dip in 0.5% chlorine solution to disinfect it from viruses. Because the problem was that doctors were basically taking paper notes into the treatment centers.
Of course,
and they were shouting patient details over the fence, and then somebody on the other side of the fence would have to write it down. So it was extremely inefficient. So we wanted to build a system that made that more streamlined. Spent probably 6 months on that, and then the team at Doctors Without Borders asked me to build and lead a project for mapping. So this is an app called MapSwipe. This is still live. There's
that's right. I saw it in your LinkedIn. Yep.
Yeah, it's currently being led by Heidelberg University and the Missing Maps project. So what this does is it basically takes in satellite imagery, and it allows people to tell a model whether within that imagery it can find like human made roads or houses or any sort of indication that there's a mapping interest there. So that instead of people who actually make these maps sort of scout through satellite imagery and they spend 90% of their time looking at trees and fields, this kind of does a lot of the work for them by separating the tasks. So you have the crowdsourced plus ML. Is there something here? And then you have the mappers that then go in afterwards and they go and actually draw the lines. And then you can, becomes very interesting because when there's disaster that hits, for example, you can use these types of algorithms and also crowdsourcing for doing things like population estimates, because maps are actually quite outdated usually. So it makes disaster response more accurate. So I did that for 2.5 years. Very, very different from gaming indeed. I decided after 2.5 years that after MapSwipe became quite successful, that it was time for me, instead of doing another project, to go back to gaming, because it's something that I'm really good and passionate at.
Yeah.
So I worked with my my team from the private server to start a game studio, and the game studio was called Ferox Games. We started working on a game called Get Wrecked. It was a 2 versus 2 brawler on mobile with dual joysticks. Before people thought dual joysticks were cool.
And could work on mobile.
we mostly got laughed out of the room for trying to make dual joysticks work, and ended up with no funding, largely because of that feedback. After that, we decided, okay, we're going to self-fund everything. So we self-funded the game studio. We actually got the game out. And then how we kind of got into metal was that we had no money left for marketing. So we needed to figure out some way to get people to play our game without going up against Supercell. And
that's right. You couldn't afford user acquisition, so you needed 100% organic.
Right. Like, our game had skill ladders, so you needed a certain level of player liquidity. Yep. You also needed a certain level of time distribution, like player liquidity at all time. So our estimate was like, in order to actually get a good idea of retention, we probably need like 10,000-ish new users per day.
Yeah.
We built the entire game on a budget of 150K, and we were out of funding. So we burned through that. And at the CPI prices back then, we would have burned through that in like 3 days. So, and that's with no game. So it wasn't really sustainable for us. We also didn't necessarily think that building games was, compared to building platforms, I think building platforms was like more of a passion for us than building games. So we wanted to build a game. I think the game was good for a prototype. I don't think it would have made it into like a large, post.
Right.
Like the world that in the competition that we were facing, frankly. But the game design and the mechanics were quite good. And so we built Metal as a user acquisition strategy for Metal. We thought, okay, we're going to show clips from these different places on the internet, and people love clips. There's no place to watch these clips. Reddit isn't really the right format because it's like mixed in with text posts. TikTok wasn't around. And so we started by just pulling in clips from all sorts of different places. And our idea was, at a certain time of the day, we would send everyone notifications saying, hey, check out our new game. And this is kind of how the Metal concept started. We then realized that a lot more people were interested in the platform concept than in the actual game itself. And so we very quickly killed off the game and really started working on the platform. We have an internal joke that one of the benefits of working at Metal is that you get to play our game. So it's only available to employees. But I don't know how long that will be true for.
Well, we'll have to go digging. We'll have to see if we can find some clips of the game somewhere in Metal.
There are.
All right. Yes. Well, there we go. You've given me a treasure hunt.
There are.
It makes me think of two things, just a little anecdotally. First of all, it's funny how influential RuneScape was to so many people. A couple of months ago, I was talking with Pierce Kicks, who works for Bitcraft Ventures, and he's like deep into sort of Web3 and crypto stuff and a real sort of thought leader there. And he was sort of drawing a very clear connection between his time doing gold farming on RuneCraft and private servers and all of his sort of RuneCraft days, and how easy it was for him to just sort of slide into the world of crypto. And now you're talking about how sort of the building and the running of a RuneCraft private server was so sort of instrumental in allowing you to kind of slide into sort of infrastructure and platform and community stuff. So man, I never actually played RuneScape. My MMO days predated that a little bit more, Ultima Online, Dark Age of Camelot kind of thing. But I feel like I missed something pretty important.
Yeah. So Pierce actually played my private server, which is pretty funny.
Small world.
That's how we ended up reconnecting actually a few years ago. Yeah,
that's super cool.
So it was this. The interesting thing about RuneScape is it had this whole economy concept that really was at the center of the game, like no other game ever been created. The entire game revolved around the economy. And the economy was, if you took the economy out, there was no game. And I just don't think that there's any game that's ever been created that was quite the same.
Interesting.
So yeah, I mean, we'll go into those things another time, but it was definitely like a picture of the internet that I think ever since has not been recreated.
I'm taking a note here. I need to get some of the original developers of RuneScape on this podcast and try and figure out what they're doing next.
Andrew Gower is actually building a game engine and a game at the moment. So yes, you should definitely look him up. I'm sure he would
fit right in.
Yep.
Okay, so just really briefly, like we will go deep into metal, but you spoke briefly about it. It's a platform. It allows clipping. Can you talk a little bit more about what it is at a super high level before we start diving into some of the interesting things that I think it's unlocking?
Yep. So when I mentioned that we pivoted into metal to kind of get our game going, so what I didn't mention is our first version of our app. It didn't really keep people engaged very much. When we started talking to our users and we started figuring out like, okay, why aren't you posting more often? We realized that most of them really just didn't have a reliable way to record.
Okay.
And then we started looking into the flows, and what we learned was that all the recorders were really built for two things. First off, they were built for long-form video. And then second, they were built to be imported into other editing software. It was very much like the professional YouTube / Twitch creator use case. And the truth was that I think we realized that most people just wanted to share quick moments with their friends. They didn't want to have to edit everything. They didn't want to have to import it into other editing software. Most of them didn't really have the money to pay for editing software. So you end up with this big janky watermark. I didn't want that either. And then the amount of steps to get from actual clipping to sharing was like, first you had to remember to start recording before a game, which eliminates 90% of people.
Then do something cool.
I mean, fundamentally, when you're recording and you're trying to do something cool, I actually think it makes you a worse player at the game. So it kind of like the whole mindset of that shifts how you enjoy your game. Whereas with like what we do, that's not true, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But so what we realized is that all these tools were built for long form. Getting short form content out of games was really, really hard. And so we started by giving people a super simple way to capture 720p clips on the CPU. This wasn't even on the GPU. The reason why we went for a CPU was because everyone has a CPU.
That's right, yeah.
And so it was not very optimized for higher quality content. It was just very, very simple. Record up to 720p. Why 720p? Because it's easily shareable, easily digestible on a mobile device, and it uploads really quickly. Yeah. So that was the beginning of metal. It wasn't some crazy thing technologically that we did. We just listened to our users. We realized some of the problems they had, and we started building. And from there on, we innovated to be able to support like really efficient high-end capture and things like that, because people do want those things, but they just want, by default, they want to be able to quickly share them.
Cool.
So what we see that being used for today kind of gets into what metal is that has evolved into a seamless way to create and share memories with your friends while you're physically apart. So we've brought the barrier down to so low that people can just forget about the fact that they're even running recording software, clip things, tag their friends, upload things really quickly, make a small edit if you need to, and use them as, really a means of connecting with their friends. And I think that's kind of the what that road has led to.
Okay, interesting. And so you said a couple of things there that
strike me, given the sort of the modern state of the world, right? So in particular, this while you're apart line, right? The phrase, while you're physically apart. So is there something about the last few years, like COVID, or just society in general, or the way that we're interacting online? Is there something you think that shifted, that has made, sharing clips kind of right place, right time? Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, why has the moment come where suddenly this is so explosive and done so often, as opposed to 5 years ago?
So if you think about how we build friendships, a lot of friendships are built because we share experiences.
Yes.
Most of the time, that's in real life. Mm-hmm. That's where you experience intense moments, build trust with people. What COVID did is they forced us to shift those relationship building skills sort of online, because we're social people, right? Like we want to connect with other people. Mm-hmm. And so what COVID did is it gave us this sense of, hey, maybe actually connecting with people just over the internet isn't that weird. And I think before that was considered as something that was secondary to your primary social connections, which were your real life friends. And what COVID did is it completely blended those two cohorts of friends. And so then the second thing is, when you think about the ways that you can interact with people over the internet, there's a few things that you can do, right? You can jump on a meeting, you can talk, you can probably play a few games in Zoom, like, memory or
Pictionary or something.
Or you can play some solitaire, or you can load up an entire virtual world that has endless social possibilities and jump in with your friends into any crazy adventure that you can imagine, whether it's a battle royale game or whether it's like Rocket League, where it's like car soccer, right? So those two things combined kind of led to, over the pandemic, games just becoming how people connect. Mm-hmm. And then what I think happened is, for a lot of people, those 2 years really, they don't have a lot of photos of themselves or with friends. And so, and so for an entire generation, their metal clips are how they remember those times, right?
I hadn't thought of that.
I was, this is very sad, but I was recently speaking to a mom who lost someone, very close to her, to COVID, her son, actually. His last 2 years, because of COVID, it was just games and friends with games. And like, the whole last 2 years of his life are captured in clips, not in physical photos.
Not in photos on his phone out in the world.
No, which is like, it's this digital gap that really exists for people who extract social value from interactive experiences. And I think that cohort is just growing. And and that is really our mission, to let people share those memories.
Oh, that's really, my head is still spinning. Okay, so for people who haven't used Metal, I'm gonna do a bad job of it, but I'm gonna try to explain it really quickly. It's always running in the background. It's going to capture whatever your gaming moments are. You don't have to pre-record. You can do something awesome and then have the confidence that it was captured, and it's in the cloud and it's easily, shareable and whatnot. But then there's also features that you can, if you choose to, layer on top of that, such as communal voice chat that can be layered on top of the game, and then various other things like effects and text and like whatever. Like, there's other stuff that you can enable people to do, light, and I would imagine perhaps in certain cases deeper editing of those clips. Can you talk at all about, like, was there one feature that really blew up in terms of user engagement? Like, did voice make a big difference? Did stickers make a big difference? Like, was there something that on top of the capturing and the sharing of clips really made a big difference in terms of how people thought about and used it?
Yeah, I would say that voice and audio and music are probably the largest drivers of additional engagement on the videos. Okay. But the truth is that these moments, they mean completely different things to every individual. There is one individual who really wants to edit how they appear in the clips and add all sorts of effects. Then there's others who just only want to include
the raw
memes,
dump.
right? Yeah, and then there's people who like, this is actually a fascinating use case. There are some people who have like auto uploads on, and they literally use clips as just a means of like what I call contextual communication, which is a way of sharing what's happening without actually saying anything. So they can be in a party on Roblox, and instead of like talking to their friends about it, they just like upload a metal clip, say come join, and their friends join, right? So it's this everyone. So our mission is to sort of increase the range of ways you can share, and then let people make their own story. And I think editing an audio are two of the biggest drivers, because people love just like entertaining people while they're watching, and music is the perfect way to do that, for example. But the range of things that people do on clips are very wide.
Cool.
Yeah.
I think I have let's dive into that in just a couple of questions. I think I ask explicitly about some of those edge cases. But when we were first talking about this a few weeks ago, you were making a really interesting sort of differentiation between the sort of performance piece of like YouTube or Twitch or something like that, and the way that your communities or your micro communities are sharing moments between themselves with metal. And you had I thought a really sort of insightful way of kind of talking about why you think the micro communities are almost a bigger opportunity than the performance pieces. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you think about sharing, there's really engagement is really moving to private groups, right? There's a whole number of trends in society that are driving it. Privacy, right? Being extremely self-aware about what you post online. And so most people are shifting a lot of their social behaviors into Discord groups, Discord servers, iMessage, groups, WhatsApp. And so, we acquired a company a few years ago called Megacool, and they've released this document every year that goes into where do things actually get shared. And I think over 80% of clips are actually shared into private channels. And they're not shared on Facebook, or they're not shared on Instagram. They're shared in like DMs. And so the big opportunity we see is really in those use cases, in helping people connect more privately. And then there is, a content piece to metal, because it's like the lowest friction way to engage with the community. But in the end, our mission is very much on connecting you more privately.
Okay. That's really interesting. And how much sharing happens behind the wall, right? That we don't see is of course super interesting. And I think a lot of us just assume that there is a lot of sharing that's going on there. It's really interesting that you guys can actually see it and have actually been able to measure it. So I think we're now going to get into that question about some of those sort of whatever, like maybe alternate use cases. And the way I look at it is like TikTok, right? So like TikTok originally started as like music, lip syncing, and like whatever, you're going to do your song and dance. And then it's evolved into the everything platform. I mean, it's life hacks, it's cooking recipes, it's imitations, it's humor, it's, whatever, it's everything, right? And I'm wondering, have you and your team, what are some of those surprise moments that you guys have come across where people are like, is there like a just chatting? Like, is there some sort of like channel or use case inside of metal where you're finding people are using this in ways you weren't expecting, that kind of shifted your perspective on sort of what exactly the platform is?
So the interesting ways that people use metal is, the most surprising to me was the contextual communication piece, which is there's a movie called Ready Player One in which Spielberg kind of envisions people like beaming these visual moments to each other without saying anything. And I think, and also without having to capture anything, right? Because you're in a virtual world. So everything is captured and generated by default. Yeah. And so you can literally, you can literally go 15 seconds back in time and replay that and put it, so you don't need to actually miss the moments in order to capture it. And so this way of communicating, I think, is going to be very, very interesting. And we're kind of seeing this on Metal today.
Cool.
Even though there's a lot of barriers to it. And then the second thing that's interesting is that there's this concept of a Metal moment, which is primarily the Valorant community uses this a lot, which is something really unexpected that you would have otherwise never captured. And so there's this Minecraft clip on Metal, for example, where someone is digging in a very specific like XY coordinate, and then exactly at that same coordinate, there's like a Slender Man, I think it's called, that falls down because that NPC was the exact same coordinates on the map and kills the player that's digging. So it's like very, very low odds event.
They won the gaming lottery.
Yeah, exactly. So the Metal moments, the things that really drive the Metal DNA, the unique parts of what drives our content is really the things that you would have otherwise never captured. Which is what we're kind of known for.
That's cool. Yeah. Like very sort of circumstantial, serendipitous moments. You weren't planning them. You weren't expecting them. They happened. Prior to Metal, you're sitting there saying, oh my God, I wish I was capturing. Nobody's ever going to believe me. Now, of course, everything can be captured all the time. Okay. That's super cool. Now, you've talked a little bit about sort of whatever friends and friends lists and micro communities. I use Metal, and so I'm relatively aware of sort of some of the inner workings of it. And obviously the friends list, right? Who you are friends with inside of Metal's, I guess you could call it like social graph, is a big opportunity, right? The social graph of Metal is a big opportunity, and I'm sure it says something really interesting in addition to the clips themselves. Can you talk at all about that? Like, what does social graph plus clip sharing do that's somehow more powerful than just whatever clip sharing via, text message or WhatsApp or some sort of one-to-one kind of, communication protocol?
Yep. So the real gap that we see is in making people that connect over games even more connected. So there are a lot of tools that we use to get more connected around real life. It's very much ingrained into culture that you do things together. And I think with games, it's still far more sporadic. There's a lot of people that sort of game regularly, but the mission of Metal is really to make the relationships deeper with the people that you game with. And so what we do is, for example, our what we call social graph is primarily built on the people you tag, because those are your closest friends.
Yep.
And so our sort of social mission for the product is by then making sharing more meaningful, because we know that you're doing it with your close friends. And then also things like, letting you know when your close friends are playing, right? And sort of bringing those like tightly connected groups of people together to game together more frequently and have more fun is what we're focused on. So in terms of social graph, it's very much focused, yes, on your close friends. I like to say it's focused on your 4 closest friends or your best friends, because it kind of clearly differentiated from every other social product, right? Most products are built for, 100-ish friends, right?
Yeah,
Whereas
and the friends of the friends of the friends of the friends kind of thing. Yeah.
Yep. The interesting things about games is that you don't actually need to design the product to do what we call like adjacent friend discovery, where you have to discover friends of friends. Like, this is what Discord's so good at, right? It's like you jump in a Discord server, you discover friends of friends. But within games actually do that for you, because you never have all your friends to play the same game. You always play with like a few people plus a few with their friends, right? So we are hyper focused on just connecting you to your 4 closest friends, and then letting really the games do the rest of the work.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, of course,
a close friend playing game X is going to be, probably the single most powerful recommendation engine out there, right? If I continuously get clips of game X from my closest friend, that's a strong motivator for me to give it a try. Particularly because if I'm not playing it, then I'm not necessarily participating in those metal moments with him or her, right?
As a show there, what's interesting is so when I do talks at conferences when they're around, I always ask the room, how many of you discovered your last game through clips? Or how many of you were motivated to play your last game because you saw clips? And roughly 80% of people usually raise their hand. And I think the interesting and why? Because clips are everywhere, right? They're on social media, they're on Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, right? But none of them actually drive the conversion, but they because like people don't click to play games from clips, right? But they heavily influence them, right? Because it's the meta, it's what people are talking about. And so this is kind of like the opportunity, right? Like yes, I think friends drive a lot of the game discovery. Yes, I believe that by focusing on your close friends, eventually that means, kind of moving away from the huge marketing spend on game launches and having a hard time breaking through, because you can kind of grow your game through the small communities on Metal that just really enjoy it, and then Metal becomes really good at getting more players for you, right? So long term, we kind of see that exact opportunity as like a way for game developers to eventually break free from like having to spend large amounts of money just to get their game out there.
Wow. That's cool.
Yep.
Well, I actually have a question a little bit later on in the doc on that, but maybe we can jump right to it. So are there dev teams today who are making Metal like a strategic part of their development or a strategic part of their community? Like they're changing the way they build their game, or they're changing the way they do community development or possibly marketing because of Metal?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it's because of Metal. I would say it's like because of like short form as a whole.
Okay.
It's also TikTok. Like it's basically short form video and making games more shareable. It's just a huge focus of game design in general. We work with studios. I don't know if we also just announced a big integration with Xbox to enable this for all of Xbox's ecosystem, for example. But I think just more generally speaking, people are designing more shareable game loops to generate more clips because, clips are a large part of organic growth of the game. So I wouldn't say they're just designing for Metal. I would say they're designing for the short form space as a whole.
That's cool. I wasn't aware about the Microsoft announcement. That's awesome. When did that happen? Congratulations. That's really huge.
Probably 3 months ago. Yeah. So,
oh, geez.
Yep.
Didn't do my homework. Yeah. I missed something.
It's all good. No worries.
You mentioned this. I thought it was a very sort of memorable quote, so I wrote it down here as a question, and then I'll bring it up again. You can decide whether it's worth diving into. At some point in time in the history of Metal, you guys had a bit of a pivot point, or you had the potential to go one way or another, and you sort of decided to bet on creators. And you think that betting on creators was, well, it's bearing fruit, and it was the right call for you guys as a platform. Can you expand on that and explain a little bit more what you mean by betting on creators and why you think that was the right play for you?
Yeah. So if you look at our space, Clips in particular, and companies that have been funded in our space, it's quite a graveyard, right? There's a lot of companies that have came before us that tried to do what we do. And frankly, they didn't make it. And the biggest learning that I had from that was that through trying to create sort of this social media platform for gamers, it became unclear to gamers what the actual selling point of the platform was, because it wasn't necessarily clear why they would use that over another social media platform. And so we very early on kind of found ourselves stuck in this place of, are we trying to both build this amazing thing for people to create and share these clips, and then are we also trying to build a great viewership product where we had like another whole large competition on the other side, right? So we were kind of fighting two battles, and on the one side you had YouTube and then increasingly TikTok and Reddit, and on the other hand you got like Shadowplay and OBS, and there were some great tools that were just incrementally getting better. And so at some point we decided that the bet that we were going to make was that we could get sharing down to being so easy, the barrier to entry being so low, that the volume of people sharing that working extremely well would eventually be strong enough of a growth driver to build that initial social like viewership engagement community.
Right.
And so instead of trying to build both for viewers and creators, we focus 100% of our efforts on sharing, which is a bet that really, really paid off for us, right? So Metal now, this is public. We have over 1 million creators that currently use it, that create content with it. And what that's done is it has brought those creators not only together outside Metal because they have a better way to create content, but also on Metal because they're responding to each other content. They're sharing with Metal links, right? It's kind of become this accepted thing because it's a high quality share link. And so, so that bet on lowering the barrier to entry as like a means of building a network, as opposed to trying to brute force the network early on, and just trusting that process for years, right? This was like a 2-year process, is I think the biggest bet in our history that has led to our success today.
I think that's great, because I think, it's something I talk about, I would say, relatively frequently on this podcast, and certainly something I will probably talk about quite a lot more in this year, is the concept of the creator, user-generated content, digital economy, creator ownership, like all of those sorts of intertwined things. And it's obviously a big space, and it's something where, there's clearly a lot of people who kind of are forced with that sort of chicken and the egg question, right? Of like, okay, well, we don't have a network, so our creators aren't creating a lot of stuff because they don't have a network. So do we build the network first? But if we build the network first, why are they there? I'm sure there's many people stuck in that loop, right? Yeah. And the fact that you guys can talk about how you broke free of that loop and met with a lot of success, hopefully will be inspirational to other people stuck in that chicken or the egg kind of quandary. And maybe some other people will say, hey, it worked for Metal, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go all in on creators, and, we'll see what happens. But anyways, I think that's really neat. So another thing that I hear a ton in my world, and I am guilty of repeating this myself on multiple occasions, is the phrase, games are the next great social network, right? And gaming is, the evolution of the social network. Some variant of this line has been repeated, 1 billion times in the last 18 months. Once COVID really became a big thing, lots of people said, okay, metaverse, whatever, persistent online worlds, whatever you want to call it, these are going to be the social networks of the future. And so obviously some companies are investing big in that space, right? The Robloxes, the Rec Rooms, the Zeppetos, like they're literally trying to build a persistent virtual world game that's also a social network in and of its own right. And yet you guys seem to be building more on this idea that the strongest social layer will sit outside of any individual game, that it's not one specific title that is your social network. It's the accumulation of all of the games that you play that is the social network. Would you say that's fair? Am I getting it right? Am I putting words in your mouth, or would you say that I that's the right perception? And so if that's the case, like, why do you think that's a better bet? Like, why didn't you want to build, with everything that you learned about RuneScape and platforms and social graph and social sharing and like all of that sort of stuff, why not build an MMO? Why not build another virtual online world and take all of these lessons and learnings into that?
Yeah. So I'll start with the first point you made, which is that like this term of social worlds being the next like social, gaming being next social. I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? Like, if you think about it, if you could choose between scrolling a feed and doing something interactive and fun with your friends and creating memories, you would always pick the second one, right? At least I think for a generation of people that grew up with that is true. I think for people who didn't, I think that maybe feels still a little foreign. So yes, I do think that this is kind of gaming as a whole, social gaming. I do think over time will really take over social interaction on the internet. And I also just think that owning one piece of where people spend, I don't think that it's going to be one central piece where people spend their time. Like,
Fair.
Look at how we spend our days, right? Everybody has different interests, different hobbies, different personalities. And the same way now there's websites for everything, like I think there will be virtual experiences for everything. There's people that are into like Roblox like games, people that are in like highly competitive games like Rocket League or League of Legends or Valorant, right? And I think I don't think there will be a single platform that will really be great at all of those things. In fact, I think you'll see highly interoperable, independent experiences that end up just being collectively who you are online as a person. And so, yes, I strongly believe, and also for a lot of those games, by the way, the meta game is actually a lot more interesting than the game itself. The community around it is so I think a lot of the engagement around games actually happens in the meta game and not necessarily in the game itself, especially socially, right? Like a lot of people prefer Discord voice chat and Discord communities over being in the actual game. Why? Because you're already chatting with your friends about the game on Discord, right? And so it's much easier to jump on a quick Discord voice channel than it is to figure out how to use the in-game party chat. So, and then also that warrants like being able to invest much bigger into that type of infrastructure because you have a lot more people using that instead of the in-game infrastructure. So, I think the metagame or what I call the glue that like connects people outside of these individual experiences is interesting. But what I think is really interesting is like everybody will probably play multiple games, right? Like I think most people they have like one main game that's like one secondary game. Then they have one like maybe a third that they only play because their friends play it and they'll go along with it. Like for me, that's Call of Duty. Like I am not a particularly great shooter player. My friends love playing Call of Duty. I would never boot it up on my own, but if my friends are playing it, I'm in, right?
Your number one is Rocket League, right?
Number one, Rocket League, and then I also play old school RuneScape. Yeah. Nice. So, exactly. So I think your identity and who you are really is, it's never going to be captured in one place. It's captured in your collection of things that you like, right? And so how you connect people is based on that collection. It's not based on that one thing. All the relationships within individual games, a lot of them are very transactional, right? It's like around a certain trade or around a certain quest or around a certain NPC, right? And so those graphs actually end up being really diluted. And so for me, the interesting part is how do you connect the people that are largely have interest in like the same games, right? That you can build really meaningful relationships with that aren't going to be around just one trade or just one raid or just one boss, right? Cool. And so this is why I think the meta game is more interesting, but that doesn't take away from the fact that like platforms like Roblox are doing great at solving that hangout piece, right? And then capturing it with metal, you know?
No, it's really cool. It's a bit of an audible here. Like this wasn't a question I was planning on asking, and so if it doesn't sort of strike a chord with you, we can scratch it from the edit. But I'm wondering, is there something about like people who define themselves by gaming versus people for whom gaming is just a pastime? I would assume that the early adopters of metal were probably the quote unquote hardcore. They were probably the people who defined themselves by the games that they played and by the relationships that they formed by the games that they played. Are you guys seeing anything like that sort of breaking that trend? Are you like seeing growth in the other areas? Like, can you imagine a world where, I don't know, like Cooking Mama hyper casual gamers are suddenly metal clipping? Or do you think you're really going to be, is there something about the role that gaming plays in someone's life that makes them more or less a metal user?
Yeah, so I think what makes you a hardcore metal user is actually that moment in time when your online presence becomes a core part of your identity as a person. And I think especially with COVID, that is becoming increasingly more true for a lot of people. People who are into like highly competitive games, they've known this for years, right?
Yes.
Like they've defined, who they play with by MMR.
Yeah, they didn't need Metal to tell them that gaming was important to them.
Exactly. You had like Tracker Network and things like that to kind of help you with that. But I think what Metal is doing is it's kind of taking that same means of self-expression and skill into every place. And that is only growing, right? As we spend more time in digital experiences, our sense of digital self and identity becomes more closely aligned with who we are.
Absolutely.
And we start caring more about capturing and sharing.
Totally. Great answer, man. That's a great answer. Okay, well, I mean, I've got one last question, and then we can wrap up. So I just want to talk a little bit about like my world right now is mobile. I mean, I worked in console, I play console games, I play PC games, but these days I primarily play on mobile, and I work entirely on mobile. And in general, I find that mobile does not get the same love as PC on anything. It doesn't get the same love on YouTube. It doesn't get the same love on Twitch. It doesn't get the same love on Metal. It's rare for a mobile title to kind of maintain any sort of significant streaming numbers on Twitch. I mean, there are, Clash of Clans and, Clash Royale do relatively well and that kind of thing. And, Call of Duty Warzone mobile. Like there are a few exceptions. But by and large, mobile is not. It's a bit of a sort of second tier when it comes to this kind of idea of sharing our digital selves. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what are some of the blockers? I mean, there's technical blockers. There might be others as well. What are some of the things that are limiting how much we sort of share our mobile gaming selves?
So if we think about self-expression in the digital world, right?
Yes.
I'm going to touch specifically on skill-based games, but
please.
I think people generally will use the device that lets them most accurately express their skill level and what they want to do. So the games that are very successful on mobile are the games where a touchscreen is actually the best way to express yourself and to express your skill. Clash Royale is a perfect example. Doing a card game with a mouse feels janky, right? And actually, like, you're misclicking, but having cards at your thumbs feels magical. It's like the ultimate expression of skill is done through a touchscreen device. And I think for people, especially in the West, who had a lot of choice growing up, gaming console, PC, mobile, and generally had and again, I'm generalizing here, but if you look at like the trend in the West is much more console than in the East. And
Absolutely.
In the East, you have much more mobile, right?
Yep.
Is if I think there's a level of dispensable income and affordability that hit the West before it hit the East, and so in the West we kind of grew up expecting that way of expressing ourselves to always be available to us. Whereas in the East, like for the most part, people learned to be extremely good at the things that had available to them, i.e. touchscreens. And so the metas in the two continents or the two parts of the world are just completely different, right? And so I think if you go to Asia, like this conversation is completely different, right? Like,
right.
Mobile gaming is a core part.
Their streaming numbers on mobile are probably through the roof.
Yep. And then when it comes to clipping specifically, so why on Metal it's a little different is mobile operating systems are quite restrictive in resource allocation, and so video capture plus mobile actually is not good for battery life.
Right.
And so really, we haven't been able to get to like, what is this great user experience that is not annoying, that people love to do passively and they don't have to think about it. I don't think we've gotten there yet. On mobile, on Android particularly, we're close, and we'll get there. And like, it's the end of the tunnel of like this resource becoming available more widely. To the operating system is increasing. Apple just released a big update that made it a lot easier, for example. So it's coming, but I think most of the reason why mobile gaming isn't big yet on Metal is technical.
Interesting. Okay.
And then eventually that will fade. Yeah.
All right. Well, then, I guess there's then two trends working in your favor then, because obviously there's the sort of
Easternization of modern mobile gaming, even in the West. The Genshin Impacts, the Call of Duties, basically Timmy just sort of teaching the rest of us that there is a whole other world out there for skill-based mobile gaming, and Western gamers gobbling that up in increasing numbers. And then also, if you say that there are sort of, operating system level evolutions happening as well that open up a little bit more, sort of power in terms of what you can do even on iOS, then, again, those two things combined should lead to a lot more sort of mobile streaming content in the years to come. So that's really cool. Okay, awesome. Well, listen, Pim, I'm checking the time. We're at almost an hour. This was amazing. You had some really interesting sort of, societal demographic, like insights into the way that people have the way they think, the way they interact, how that's evolved as a result of COVID, that I found insightful and really amazing. And you paired that with just some deep techie gaming nerdiness that I just loved. I had a blast in this conversation. So, really, thank you very much. Before I close, is there anything that you thought we were going to get a chance to talk about that we didn't get to cover? Is there any area that you were like just champing at the bit to cover, or should we just salute each other and leave it at that?
Nah, maybe I'll leave it with that. I think one of the other things that made it that Metal was possible was that gamers are, largely because of Discord, gamers are now very closely connected. Mm-hmm. And so a big thing that was different between when Metal wasn't around and when it was around and the companies that filled before us was that there wasn't really any platform that closely connected gamers. And platforms like Discord, there's more. They've really opened up consumer and social in games. And I think there's not enough people building for it. I think we would see so much more innovation if we had more people building for on these graphs. I think I actually think there's a lot of opportunity there. So if there's any entrepreneurs listening, building on Metal Discord ecosystems, the platform that really thrive on the meta game and connect gamers, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And it's a great place to as someone who built apps in the Facebook days where like every day it felt like it became harder, having platforms like Discord and like around just have made it feel like a breath of fresh air. And like Microsoft is also very much moving in this direction. So these open graphs, these open ecosystems that connect people are an amazing opportunity to build companies. So go do it.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. Microsoft Discord. You guys are changing the world. Keep it up.
Yeah.
All right, Pim, thank you so much. This has been amazing. Have a wonderful day. All the best to you and your team. All the best for Metal. I'll continue happily using it. You've got a fan in me. And thanks for being on the podcast.
Bye.
And that's the end of another episode of the Tomorrow with Rovio podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben Mattis. Thanks so much for sharing your morning, evening, afternoon, whatever it is, sharing your time with me and exploring these themes. Hopefully you enjoyed the interview today with the CEO of Metal, Pim de Witte, and understanding where his thoughts are going in terms of online worlds and how the moments that we spend inside of these games are increasingly becoming a critical component of our being, and the need to share those with our friends is almost as important as the ability to sort of send an image to a friend. I found him a very insightful guest, and it really sort of changed my way of thinking about the importance of sort of social shareability of these gaming experiences that we live every day when we're a gamer. So Pim, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your insight. And to all the listeners, obviously, as always, if you have any thoughts or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at MOOK. You can find me on LinkedIn. Just search for Ben Mattis. It shouldn't be hard to find. You can send me an email, ben.mattis, that's MATTES, @rovio.com. Would love to hear your thoughts on the show, guests you've really enjoyed, future guests you think we should be talking to, or even just themes you think we should be exploring. And of course, as always, if you enjoy this podcast, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe, smash that bell as it were, because it gives us a lot of really useful feedback about the sort of numbers of listeners we have and sort of how engaged you are and makes me feel good. That's a really important part. As always, have a great day. Talk to you soon. Bye.